This is why you should never tune into the unknown, because once you do, it might just start tuning into you. On certain nights, when the world is quiet and the darkness feels more oppressive than comforting, there exists a frequency on the radio that whispers like a ghost in the static. It's an eerie, mechanical voice that drones on, repeating sequences of numbers in a tone so monotonous it's almost hypnotic. 14, 22, 7, 3. No one knows where these broadcasts come from, or who or what might be behind them. These mysterious transmissions, known as number stations, have haunted the airwaves for decades, their origins shrouded in secrecy. Many dismiss them as relics of the Cold War, long-forgotten tools of espionage. But for those who have listened, really listened, they are something far more disturbing. They are the echoes of a darkness that defies understanding, a signal that pulls you in and refuses to let go. You may think you're safe, that it's just a curiosity, just a bit of odd noise to be laughed off. But for some, the number station is more than just a mystery. It's a doorway to a nightmare from which there is no escape. Stephen Matthews was an ordinary man by all accounts. He was a software developer living in a small town, married with 2 young children. His life was comfortably uneventful, defined by routines and the quiet predictability of suburban life. He had a passion for amateur radio, a hobby he had picked up from his father, who had been an avid ham radio operator. On weekends, Stephen would retreat to his basement, where he had set up a small radio station, complete with an old shortwave receiver that he had meticulously restored. He enjoyed scanning the airwaves, searching for distant broadcasts, exotic music, and voices from far-off lands. It was a solitary hobby, but one that brought him a sense of peace. One night, as Stephen was idly twisting the dial, he stumbled upon something unusual, a faint signal buried in the static, almost too weak to make out. He adjusted the receiver, trying to clear up the interference, and slowly, a voice emerged. It was a woman's voice, cold and devoid of any emotion, reciting a series of numbers. 8, 19, 2, 11. He began to tune in regularly, almost obsessively, keeping meticulous notes of the sequences, convinced that there was a pattern, a code, hidden within the randomness. His notebooks filled up with rows of numbers, charts, and diagrams as he tried to decipher their meaning. It was as if the numbers had taken hold of his mind, planting a seed of obsession that grew with each passing day. Stephen's obsession with the number station deepened, consuming more and more of his time and energy. He stopped going to bed at night, spending hours hunched over his radio, scribbling notes in the dim light of his basement. His once meticulous appearance began to deteriorate. He stopped shaving, his hair grew unkempt, and dark circles formed under his eyes. He started missing work, ignoring his family, isolating himself in his basement for days on end. His wife, Sarah, grew increasingly worried, but every time she tried to talk to him about it, he would brush her off, muttering something about the code and how he was close to understanding it. One night, after weeks of near total isolation, Stephen had a breakthrough, or at least, that's what he believed. He was convinced that he had cracked the code, that he had uncovered a message hidden within the numbers. He burst out of the basement, wild-eyed, clutching a sheet of paper covered in numbers and strange symbols. He ranted to Sarah about how the numbers weren't just a code, but a warning about something terrible that was coming, something that was already here. He spoke of shadows in the static, of voices that weren't human, of a presence that had been guiding him all along. Sarah was terrified. She had never seen her husband like this, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes filled with a madness that she didn't recognize. She pleaded with him to stop, to take a break, but he wouldn't listen. He was too far gone, too deep into the mystery that had consumed him. That night, Stephen disappeared. He left the house without a word, leaving behind his wife and children, and vanished into the darkness. The only trace he left behind was his notebook, filled with incomprehensible scribbles, and his radio still tuned to the number station, the voice reciting its endless, chilling sequence. Days turned into weeks, and there was no sign of Stephen. The police conducted a search, but they found nothing, no clues, no leads, nothing to suggest where he might have gone. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. Sarah was beside herself with grief and worry, unable to understand what had happened to her husband. Then, one night, nearly a month after his disappearance, she received a phone call. The voice on the other end was faint, barely audible over the crackle of static. But she recognized it immediately. It was Stephen. He was rambling, incoherent, his voice filled with fear. He spoke of dark places, of voices that whispered in the static, of numbers that were not numbers, but something else entirely. He told her that he had seen things that no one was meant to see, things that had driven him to the brink of madness. He warned her to stay away from the radio, to destroy it, to forget about the number station. And then, before she could ask him where he was, the line went dead. The call was traced to a remote area in the mountains, miles from anywhere, a place Stephen had no reason to be. The police conducted a search of the area, and after several days, they found him. He was wandering through the forest, disoriented and terrified, his clothes torn and dirty, his face gaunt and hollow. He was clutching a piece of paper covered in numbers, the same numbers he'd been obsessed with. When they tried to talk to him, he could only mutter fragments of sentences, incoherent ramblings about shadows and whispers, and something that was coming. Stephen was taken to a psychiatric hospital, where he was diagnosed with a severe mental breakdown. He refused to speak about what had happened to him, and he seemed to have no memory of the weeks he had been missing. The doctors believed that his obsession with the number station had driven him to the brink of insanity, but Sarah wasn't so sure. There was something in his eyes, something dark and fearful, that made her believe he had seen something far worse than a mere hallucination. As news of Stephen's disappearance and subsequent return spread, the number station that had ensnared him became an object of intense fascination. Radio enthusiasts, conspiracy theorists, and curious onlookers began to tune in, drawn by the mystery and the strange story of the man who had vanished into the static. The station's broadcast grew stronger, its signal reaching further and further across the airwaves, as if it were feeding off the attention. Some listeners claimed that the numbers had begun to change, forming patterns that were too deliberate to be random. They started to hear voices in the background of the broadcast, faint, distorted voices that seemed to be speaking in a language no one could understand. Others reported strange occurrences, lights flickering, radios turning on by themselves, whispers in the darkness when they were alone. It was as if the station was reaching out, pulling people in, driving them to the same madness that had consumed Stephen. Then, one night, the station broadcast something that sent chills down the spines of those who heard it. The broadcast lasted for hours, the voice growing louder and more distorted with each repetition, until it finally cut off in a burst of static. Those who heard the broadcast reported feeling a presence in the room with them, a cold, suffocating presence that filled them with an inexplicable terror. It was as if the number station had come alive, as if it were no longer just a signal, but something more, a living, malevolent entity. Then, one night, the number station broadcast a sequence that sent chills down the spines of those who heard it. For the first time, the voice deviated from its usual pattern, reciting a series of numbers that were familiar to anyone who had been following the news coordinates that led to a secluded area deep in the forest where Mark had been found. Investigators were dispatched to the location, but what they discovered was beyond anything they could have imagined. The site was littered with old, decaying equipment, radios, antennas, and strange devices of unknown origin, all arranged in a circle around a single ancient tree. Carved into the tree's bark were the same numbers that had been broadcast by the station, and beneath it, buried shallowly in the earth, they found human remains, dozens of them, all unidentified, all seemingly forgotten by time. The discovery sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. It was clear that the number station was not just an artifact of the past, but something far more sinister. Attempts to shut it down failed every time a signal was blocked. Another would spring up on a different frequency, as if the station was determined to be heard. Those who had been exposed to the broadcasts began to exhibit strange behaviors, similar to Marx's descent into madness. Some disappeared just as he had, only to be found later, disoriented and terrified, with no memory of where they had been. It was as if the numbers station was using them, manipulating their minds for some unknown purpose. And all the while, the broadcasts continued, the numbers counting down to something that no one could comprehend. So, what is the true purpose of the number station? Is it merely a relic of the Cold War, or has it become something much more dangerous? Who or what is behind the voice that recites those endless sequences? And the most chilling question of all, what happens when the numbers final?